Owen Jones is facing legal action by BBC editor Rafi Berg by supposedly smearing him. So back in December 2024, Jones wrote a 9,000-word report into the pro-Israel bias of the BBC on Dropsite. Now, Jones documented Rafi Berg's pro-Israel bias. His reporting often praised Israeli soldiers and settlers while leaving out facts about occupation and human rights abuses. Berg attended a pro-Israel rally during Israel's 2009 Gaza assault and later wrote a book celebrating Mossad, earning praise from Israeli officials and even a spot on Netanyahu's bookshelf. Other BBC staff have been punished for pro-Palestinian views, with colleagues accusing him of shaping coverage to favour Israel's perspective. The pro-Israel bias from the BBC is clear, and Jones did a great job documenting this. But now Berg wants to sue him. Court filings seen by the Press Association show Berg is suing for damages, claiming the article harmed his reputation and had caused him fear, anxiety, humiliation, upset, and distress. His barrister John Stables said Berg had faced an onslaught of hatred, intimidation, and threats, allegedly including death threats after publication. Following the piece, protests erupted outside BBC offices and a petition demanded Berg's suspension. Jones dismissed the claim, saying, "I strongly disagree with Mr. Berg's accusations, and I look forward to vigorously defending my reporting in court." Now, of course, look, people should be receiving, abuse and especially anti-Semitic attacks if he did get that. But these people need to be held to account. There's a genocide going on, and the BBC has given cover to them. But it's obvious that Berg is a Zionist. I mean, here's Berg admitting on video that Mossad makes him proud.
But, it's a wonderful thing to, how often do you get to be accepted into a circle of trust among the people who belonged to, some of who still work for the Mossad, and sit across the table from them and learn the most incredible stories of modus operandi and tactics and subterfuge. And we don't have the time. I'd love to spend another half an hour talking about tremendous, Danny, shut your ears for the moment, but if I use the James Bond style methods which are employed, cash hidden in chocolate boxes. I'm not sure if that was true or not, but it was told to me, or things like that, which really, as a Jewish person, an admirer of the state of Israel, then to know that these people carry out these kinds of fantastic operations. It's what makes you tremendously proud. Absolutely. Talking about it, still gives me goosebumps.
The Israel bootlickery is strong with this one. Truly embarrassing. Now, look, you've seen the litany of headlines from the BBC and their use of passive language when it comes to Palestinians. So the headline on the left is how the BBC initially reported a story of a Gaza man with Down syndrome who was left to die after being attacked by an IDF dog. It was only after complaints that they changed it to include the proper context. But even after the rewrite, Owen Jones points out that they still needed to add a flavour of pro-Israel propaganda. Eventually, the BBC decided to rewrite the story. It changed the headline to "Gaza man with Down syndrome attacked by IDF dog and left to die, mother tells BBC." It also inserted 2 new paragraphs at the top of the piece, informing readers that the Israeli military had admitted that a Palestinian man with Down syndrome who was attacked by an army dog in Gaza was left on his own by soldiers after his family had been ordered to leave, and that he was found dead by his family a week later. Even with the new phrasing, the story implied that the dog had attacked Bar of its own violation, not that it was under the control of IDF personnel. When it comes to the BBC covering the deaths of both Israelis and Palestinians, look at the coverage versus the actual number of deaths. So at the top of the graph, you can see the deaths are largely in equal measure in terms of coverage, right? And then there's a massive spike of coverage of killed Israelis in April despite the fact that Palestinians have been killed in their tens of thousands at the time. This is another example of a biased BBC headline when human rights organisation Amnesty released their report into Israel's genocide. So it says that, so the headline is Israel rejects fabricated claims of genocide. That's clearly biased. I mean, the headline should have read Israel is committing genocide according to human rights organisation Amnesty. This is the BBC refusing to retract its claim that an Al Jazeera journalist was working with Hamas, despite it not being true. They refused to retract that. Helena, of course, we can't be too specific with the legal proceedings that will play out in court if it gets that far. But much of the right-wing media has painted the BBC as somehow sympathetic to Hamas. I mean, this is obviously absurd.
I mean, you just have to look at the claims that they make about the BBC's supposed bias towards Hamas that comes from Zionists, that makes you realize, that they're completely nonsensical. The biggest claim that I've heard from Zionists as to why the BBC is a propagandering of Hamas. I mean, literally, they call everything Hamas. They're calling the BBC of all things Hamas. Given the stuff that you've talked about already, there seems patently ridiculous. But their central claim is that, well, the BBC should be describing Hamas as a terrorist organisation in its coverage, and it doesn't. It describes them as a militant group as part of their coverage, because one of those is an objective fact. They are a militant group. No one on either side of the discussion would disagree with this. But the label of them being terrorists is entirely opinion-based. It's especially more important to understand this when it is also the official opinion of the British government that they're a terrorist group. The government has prescribed Hamas as a terrorist organisation, and that is not an objective fact that they have decreed. It's a fact that they have done that, but the designation is not fact. That is an opinion of the government they could revoke at any time by an act of parliament to be able to do that, to get it voted through the Commons. The BBC is a public broadcaster, not a state broadcaster. The public broadcaster has to have operational independence from the state. Otherwise, it becomes Russia Today. It becomes Press TV. If it doesn't have operational independence, then it's a state broadcaster. But it's not. It's a public broadcast. It's publicly funded, but totally independent. And therefore, what it can't do to maintain its, the sanctity of its impartiality is take the government's line on anything as rote, which it would be if it described Hamas as a terrorist organisation. I'm sure plenty of people believe that they are. This is certainly a contentious topic. But when the government of the day are officially of the opinion that they are, for the BBC that is meant to be critical of the government, critical in the broader term, not like opposed, but to take criticism and skepticism of what the government does or doesn't say to maintain its operational independence. If it were to describe Hamas unilaterally as a terrorist organisation, they would therefore be taking the government's line on something that they should be impartial on. It would be perfectly reasonable for the BBC, for example, to say the militant group Hamas, of which the government has prescribed as a terrorist organisation. That's perfectly reasonable. That's describing two facts. But to say that they are terrorists is opinion. And that's not what the BBC is for. On the subject of Owen Jones, I think it'll be interesting to see how far this goes. Interesting to see what information might come out. There's a phase in these kind of litigations where both sides present a lot of their facts. So that will be the thing that will give us more information, I guess, after all this saga is completed. Depending on how far it goes, we don't know where it's supposed to go. And it's worth pointing out, you can have somebody who is in a position of power at the BBC who has certain ideological predilections, who then don't act upon it in their role as an editor or as a media presenter or whatever it is. It's perfectly acceptable to have somebody who is ideologically motivated, because lots of people are, especially people involved in news and politics, who set that aside for impartial and non-biased coverage, of which the BBC is the main purveyor of news in this country that has very strict impartiality guidelines. Perfectly reasonable to do that. Of course, the evidence will be presented and we'll end up seeing where that goes, which should be interesting.
You're absolutely right. I mean, it's impossible to not be biased. We all have our own internal biases. That's fine. You can't expect anything else. But, there's been people who've worked for the BBC, no longer work for them, and say, look, systematically, pro-Palestinian voices are either ignored or they're deliberately changed in a way to make it look more favourable to Israel. We pointed out some examples, and that is a drop in the ocean of the examples you can find on the BBC's bias towards Israel. I mean, Berg can be a Zionist and work at the BBC as long as he upholds the upholds the impartiality. Of course, I wouldn't personally like to have a Zionist in the BBC, but like, again, you can't control other people's views, but you can be careful in making sure that certain wording isn't misplaced, or a certain sentence isn't used, or passive language, which, by the way, the BBC aren't the only one. The entire media do it. When Russia attacks and kills innocent people, it's Russia murders innocent people, correctly says it. And then when it's the Palestinians, it's like, oh, wonder where that bomb came from. Oh, there's bullet holes in babies' foreheads, must have accidentally slipped. Like, it's crazy.